around you. What does the world feel like? Imagine how it would feel if you could hear with your eyes or see with your ears. This is what it means to have synesthesia, a rare neurological trait that gives rise to a merging of the senses. My name is Simner. I'm a professor of neuropsychology, and I've spent the last 20 years studying the minds and brains of people with synesthesia. Now, there are lots of different ways to have synesthesia. Some people see colours when they hear music. Other people with synesthesia feel tastes in their mouth when they read words. Others picture the months of the year in particular patterns in space, perhaps January's up here and December's down here. Other synesthetes hear sounds when they look at bright colours, or when they see silent moving objects. We think there are over 100 different ways of experiencing synesthesia, but only a relatively small number of people in the world who do this. So what's it like to have synesthesia? Now, I'm reminded of a conversation I've had with a fellow scientist who himself is a synesthete. He sees colours from the sounds of different instruments. When he was a boy, his parents used to take him to the Symphony in New York. And he thought the house lights dimmed before the performance started, just so people could see the colours better. For him, the colours hung over the orchestra, and he assumed they could be seen by everyone. So some synesthetes feel like their colours are out there in the world, but other synesthetes experience their colours like pictures in the mind's eye, and others still simply know what those colours must be. So how can someone see colours when they're not there? Well, modern neuroscience methods have allowed us to peer into the brains of people with synesthesia. And we've seen they have tiny differences in the wiring around the region of the brain that processes colours. So this region in the brain, the colour region, can spring into action, not just when they get a message through the eyes, but also when they get a message through the ears. So importantly, redness is not something on a rose, in fact, it's just something in your brain. It's a feeling that happens when your colour regions light up. And this region just happens to be a little more interconnected in synesthetes. It's normal, it's just a bit rare.
The most interesting thing about living with it for me is probably the way that it creates this map of the world that is so abstract, but so incredibly tangible for me. My synesthesia in particular is not particularly strong. There's sort of this continuum of synesthesia. So on one end you have people who, when they hear music, they sort of just have a sense of the color that they're seeing. And then on the other end, you have people for whom it's actually like a film that comes over their eyes when they see that color. So mine is more on the end of just sort of a sense of the color. But I know for some people, it can be quite detrimental to everyday life. I think the most exciting part for me, of course, is that I am a musician. So I remember being very, very young and listening to music and having this sense of the colors in my mind and talking to my parents about it. And my parents were both scientists, so they were more interested in the science side of it. But as I grew up and as I was playing music, it was always so interesting to have this extra aspect of the music that I was playing. And particularly as I got into doing higher levels of music and playing higher levels of music, it was another way of interpreting the music that I was playing. So I had this map of the music that was coming from just knowing the notes and knowing the rhythms and where it's loud and where it's soft and that sort of thing. But then I had this other map of where are the colors going in this piece and where are the colors changing. And that sort of created another way of interpreting the music and another way of even learning the music sometimes. When I was in high school, I had a piano teacher who I had met through a music camp in southern Manitoba. And I was taking lessons from him, and he knew of Shirley, And so I ended up meeting Shirley just through a master class that we were doing that he had sent me to at CMU, at the Canadian Mennonite University, and I played for her. I got a sense a little bit of what CMU was like, and then decided to come there for my undergrad and work under Shirley in her piano studio.
I had been informed already that she was a synesthete, and she actually came to a lecture class that we were working on, and that particular day we were working on Messiaen, and was also a synesthete. So I asked Anna, even before we had spent any time together, whether she would speak for 5-10 minutes on what synesthesia was to kind of put Messiaen's world into context. And the minute she started speaking, she's so well-spoken and so elegant, never mind the wonderful pianist that she is, my mind was already reeling as far as I need to know more, I need to know more. And the piano lessons that we had, it was very good for a couple of months, and finally I just said, I need to know how this works. And so she had just played this big Chopin ballade, and I had made my notes in her performance, and then I said, okay, walk me through it. So she walked me through all the colors that happened, and there was 2 sections that were, she said, it's kind of strange because these 2 sections were black. She played them note perfectly, and black's not a color for her. And for me, in my notes, I had already flagged those were 2 sections we needed to work on. Not technically it was all perfect, but it was just that her brain wasn't latching on. It was a transition, it's romantic music, so it's very straightforward structured-wise, harmonically, but her brain wasn't quite sure where this bridge was going to, so it was kind of sitting in this unknown zone, and I found that fascinating. And then in another part of the piece, there was a section where the downbeat was red, and then there was this tremolo happening that was in blue. And I said, what's happening here? And she said, oh, there's the blue section. And because she was very involved in the octaves, which were difficult. And so for someone else, I would have said, you loosen up your arm or whatever, because don't worry about those octaves and concentrate on this downbeat. So I said, well, this actually isn't the blue section, it's the red section, because I needed those downbeats and then this tremolo to just be shimmering in the background. And so I said this, and she did it immediately. And I was just like, my mouth was on the floor. It's like we've been talking like this all the time. And I was like, so from there, the conversations kept going. You often talk about color in a music lesson, but now I had to use that word a little more judiciously because it was very literal for her, and I always find that fascinating. Primarily, I'm a painter these days. I am still teaching. I love music, but I just don't have time to be on the stage and teach and paint as much as I'd love to. I have done some projects where I've played on stage and had the art behind me, either on a big screen or the actual art. But I've kind of focused my artistic voice on canvas, and then pass on my love for music through the teaching.
For a long time, we had been wanting to do something beyond just talking about synesthesia. We wanted to create something that was a lot more tangible for people and that was a lot more interesting for them, other than just having like 4-hour conversations about music and art. So I think that eventually we got to this concrete point where we were saying, okay, we need to create this visual map that we can give people to show them like what is actually happening in the brain.
The title is Spectrum, the Color of Music, and it's literally that. It's a multimedia experience between orchestra that connects orchestra music with an art exhibition. And the connector, of course, is Anna. And as I said, the orchestra brings a much richer color to that. And so this music that she picked, we were fascinated that halfway through the research project, we discovered that Rimsky-Korsakov himself was a synesthete.
People with synesthesia sometimes have special talents, like better memory, and they also score higher in tests of creativity. Sometimes this creativity reaches levels of genius, and we have good reason to think that synesthesia has driven some of the most creative and insightful leaps in mankind, from physicists like Richard Feynman to poets like Arthur Rimbaud, and perhaps the composer Rimsky-Korsakov.
We are always attracted to things we don't know, the fairy tales, the unknown lands, the mysterious, the exotic, and that has been with us forever, and this piece is all about discovering new territories and new colors, and also lots of storytelling. It's one of the, for me, it's one of the first real, evident soundtracks. When Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was composing it, actually it was a difficult time in his life because he had some kind of a creative momentum where he had to realize where he's going. And at that time, lots of Russian artists were very attracted to this idea of Orientalism, you know, everything which is Persian or Turkish or Arabia. So he was very taken with that. And one important feature for Rimsky-Korsakov's music is, of course, his distinct connection between the sound and the color. He's written quite a few pieces where the C, for example, is prominent. And it is very often, if not always, in E major, the key of E major, which for him was always distinctly blue. It's known by all music professionals that Rimsky-Korsakov was absolutely a maverick when it comes to orchestral colors, a combination of different instruments, or instruments used in certain register or with certain dynamic or rhythms that create this very unique soundscape. And of course there are two main protagonists in the story, and each gets their own theme. The piece opens with a mighty and powerful and in a way also obsessed Sultan Shahryar, who knows that he has unlimited powers, not only acquiring as many wives as he wants, but he actually can put their life to an end if they don't seem to please him the way he feels each and every night. And it's a grand opening of the orchestra, the full force, everyone playing the same tune, and you just feel this kind of powerful and somewhat psychopathic, I would say, individual. And then there's Scheherazade, which is all about the mystery and the beauty and graciousness and sensuality. And this is the violin solo, the famous violin solo that recurs throughout the piece on so many occasions, as well as the theme of the Sultan Shahryar comes. And the game between these two protagonists begins very, very soon. And it's also, this whole piece is also an incredible showcase for practically all the instruments of the orchestra. It's like a guide through the symphony orchestra. Practically every instrument has a solo, whether it's very elaborated or a little shorter, but there's not a single register which is left unexposed. And in the beginning, you feel that Shahryar is still completely sure of his case. He knows that even Scheherazade, who he's attracted to, and she's interesting, and she has the stories, but he knows she won't survive as well, like every other. And he's very kind of not aggressive, but very possessive. And Scheherazade, in her responses to his advances, is always, wait a little, wait a bit, there's more to come. And you feel in music as well that there's more and more longing, curiosity and eagerness, but also expectations, you know, and at a certain point she completely seizes control, and then the storytelling unfolds with all the other movements, and you just feel the power of the sea, that the travel begins. And for Rimsky-Korsakov, the sea was also something very personal. He comes from generations of naval officers, and himself was a trained naval officer. So you really feel the power of the ocean and this ship in that vast amount of water, and yet it has its trajectory and the pulse, and it's very evocative, the piece.
Rimsky-Korsakov he kind of summarized it perfectly for me, because he describes this Scheherazade as a kaleidoscope of fairy tale images. And I love that, because we all have that childhood experience where we look through this tube at an image, and then we twist the dial, and all of a sudden everything becomes distorted, and the colors start overlapping all over each other. And that's what this project was for me. It was like I started on what I thought was stable ground, and then I fell down this rabbit hole, and I just was in this wash of a musical rainbow of colors. And even though we're not dealing with health, we are offering audiences a pretty powerful freeze frame image of the brain in action outside of a medical scan. So the central 4 pieces in this exhibition will literally be stripes on canvas that have been mathematically calculated to the amount of time that Anna sees each color in context of the length of the piece. And we've finished 3 movements already, and those, it's about 30 minutes of music, and there's 371 changes of colors and textures. It's not always a different color, but the changes that happen in 30 minutes. And this doesn't even take into account her own thoughts or her own imagination. This is just her brain working in the background and responding to the music that she hears.
I took that piece of music and I had a great big score in front of me that had all the instruments on it, it had all of the instrumentation, and I listened to the piece all the way through, and I had a whole bunch of pencil crayons, and I would mark in the colors that I was seeing within the specific instruments and at the specific time, and then I gave that score with all of my color markings in it to Shirley.
I had to begin with those notes. For me, those stripes were the notes. And so the musician in me had to understand more intimately what her language was. And so I had to develop a consistent language texturally, because she does experience jaggedness or bark-like or misty or raindrops or prickly and big waves and small waves. And so fortunately I work with gel mediums a lot in my practice, and so there is that textural quality to it already. I just had to develop something consistent. And then she was given 3 big Benjamin Moore palettes, so it wasn't just, this is yellow Shirley, like she would zone in and it's like this particular number, and then 6 bars later it might be just two flags down on that same page of a different kind of yellow, because now the oboe came in, and that changed the colors. When we started imagining this project, it was important for us that it be orchestra, because that augments her experience. So the textures and the timbres of the different instruments and the wide dynamic range that the orchestra offers all came into play for the colors that are created.
The color scheme was actually not what I was expecting either. My colors, they go along as I'm listening to a piece, and I don't really think about the overarching colors that are the most prevalent in a piece. And the way that Shirley did these paintings was she has vertical stripes that are all the colors that I'm seeing. So it's sort of like a linear progression from one side of the painting to the other. So you start on one end, and then the music goes and the painting goes. And to me, it was just incredible to see it in real life, to see it visually outside of my own brain, because that was something that I had never experienced before, and I don't think I ever thought that I would experience that in my life.
These stripes, many of them are 2 millimeters big. So to put a texture on 2 millimeters, it's changing every 3 to 5 seconds on average. And the end of the second movement, it's just a big fortissimo chord that happens it's kind of staccato in the orchestra. It's a millisecond. So I didn't actually even paint the canvas, I painted the side of the canvas, the bright red that particular chord was.
I think what was most interesting for me was I'd never had to communicate this private map of the world that I had that was all of these colors to another human being in so much detail. People ask a lot of the time about what colors I'm seeing overall in a specific piece, or what colors I'm seeing within a 15 to 20 second interval, and that's usually pretty easy. But Shirley was asking, what do you see in this 1 second interval that's happening in this piece? And I never had to think so deeply about what I was actually seeing in my brain. And it was a struggle, but it was such a good struggle, and I think it brought me a lot closer to the music that I was listening to, and even to this visual map that had kind of always been there, but I hadn't put a whole lot of thought into it until we actually did this project. It was incredible. I didn't even know how to respond. It was so much more detailed than I was expecting it to be.
I'm a musician and I'm a painter, but the fact that she could live in the world of sound and color simultaneously was just mesmerizing for me, because I have a very clear philosophy on how those two work. As a musician, I'm not a composer, I'm not a jazz artist, I'm an interpreter. So I start with something very tangible, it's black and white, and then it's my job to interpret it and create an experience for people. the 16 feet of canvas was a freeze frame image, a still on a movie reel of what she hears in these 45 minutes. And I had to start with that, because then there's another subtitle to the title of the project, and that's Precision and Impression. And that spoke to the precision of me, the musician, and then the impression that I'm taking away from that to do my own abstracts using her palette. And so there's a combination of her movements, these stripes, and then I do a movement for each one of those movements using that particular palette and using the colors that are in that palette, and which were very different for me because there was a lot of colors that I'm used to using that she doesn't see. And so I just, I wanted to sneak them in. But the musician said, no, you can't use those notes here. And these main palettes of the stripes, they're very powerful, they're very strong. I did that on purpose. Anna doesn't actually see them to this degree of, they're much more porous and transparent in her world. I wanted audiences to be able to see the range of the colors, and I needed to do that. It spoke louder if I was using very solid colors. And so I do one movement that's very soft, it's almost like watercolors, and that's probably more true to the world that she lives in. They do blend in from one color to the next, but it's very hard to blend when it's only 2 millimeters big. Otherwise the central piece would have been 80 feet long. Quick overview, it's in the key of E minor, goes to E major, but it starts, so the yellow, that's Anna's color of E minor, and this is the introduction of the Sultan's theme, and here comes the Scheherazade. And the interesting part of this movement for me was that this particular section is red, and red is not one of the harmonic colors. But this, interesting enough, sections of this happen previous in the canvas, where she's changing colors every 3, 4, 5 bars, 3, 4, 5 seconds. But here she doesn't, and it was the exact same music. This is the climax of this first movement. It's very intense, and it's a little bit faster, but it's very similar orchestration to here, similar music. It's just now it's building and building, and so her brain is overriding the harmonic changes by going into this red zone, literally, and it just stays there. And as soon as the climax is over and we break into this beautiful cello and wind section, she goes back to changing colors. This is the first movement, the sea in Sinbad's ship. And so what I wanted to do in this particular one is give a little bigger voice to the textures that Anna experiences. So she talks about pastoral greens, so there's kind of this reference there. She talks about big palette knife textures, so I used that in here. And then remember I talked about the big climax was in red, so that was the red, the fan going up across the middle of the whole canvas, and that's kind of a focal point for me. But again, here's the blue and yellow swirls of the brass that was experienced there. The big waves that are happening within the colors that she uses. There was a bark-like imagery that she talked about, so that's in this particular circle. There was a misty blue that I kind of played with as the background. This is a big showcase for the orchestra, of the soloists in the orchestra. So all these half lines that you see, that's soloists, or some, it might be a whole section, but a solo line, solo melody over the rest of the orchestra, or sections of the orchestra. And so it's a real showcase for it, and as you can see, there's a ton of tiny lines. This little section here, it's just changing 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. There's tiny little green neon pop that just happened for a millisecond. It was a lot of work for her to document all the changes that are happening. This for me was kind of interesting. It's a pattern that happens in the orchestra. It's a very intense section, and it was interesting. There's lots of rubato here. That means the conductor has a lot of freedom as far as tempo. And when I timed it and measured the time that she calculated the time that she saw the colors, they were exact. So the conductor was bang on. But just to see it, the literal repetition of the dark maroon and then the brown over the gray and this pop of of dark gray with and then the trumpet coming in. The whole orchestra is playing, but it's just kind of holding a long note. And then there's this boom sforzando chord right at the end, but it's literally a millisecond. So I didn't actually make a line from the front of the canvas, but I painted just the side of the canvas red, even though that, so that you could, when you see it, it's just from the edge, and it's really just such a split second that it happens. I used a very grid, angular approach to kind of reflect those strong rhythms, and a kind of cubist kind of take. So there's a grid going sideways, there's grid lines going vertical, and then there's the bisecting diagonal lines. And so they start very symmetrically or on the outside, but then those lines start becoming wavy on the inside. And this was a little reference to Rimsky-Korsakov talks about this music as a kaleidoscope of fairy tale images, and so I kind of used that word kaleidoscope. So that's where the turning starts happening in the middle, and that's what this reference on the inside is here. And so I've picked 7 instruments. There's 7 instruments here used kind of abstractly, and only the colors that the instruments play in are the colors that I've used where those instruments appear. So they're obviously abstracted a little bit, but this is the cello, kind of a front-on view. So the neck is kind of sweeping to the side. There's some combinations with the strings and the trombones. Trombones are the big powerhouse in this particular piece. And so this is actually now becomes the bell of the trombone, and then the lines going up, and you'll see the arc of the trombones in the top of the instrument. And so that was the trombone, and then this is a reference to the flute and the piccolo section, with the mouthpiece being here. And then this long tube coming across the side of the canvas is a reference to the winds. So there's the clarinet mouthpiece, and then the oboe mouthpiece, and they all use the same body, and the bell's at the bottom. And then here's a reference to the bassoon mouthpiece, which is kind of cool. And then this is a reference to the French horns, and they're in those blue tones with this bit of ivory and orange inset. The third movement is the love story. This is the young prince and the young princess. This is a big aria for the whole orchestra, so there's very little, there's a handful of half lines where there's some melodies in the orchestra. But basically it's this one glorious lines of melodies, fairly repetitive, but it's based in the key of G major, so the purples is the primary color. So we both love the color palette of this particular movement with its pinks and magenta colors augmenting the purple. We've been very linear till now, and she doesn't actually see them so concretely. They blend more from one to the next. So this is a reference to bringing that voice to the forefront. So it's just very abstractly, everything's bleeding together. This is the one where I talked about the pinks and the purples is the primary color. So there's still a sweep or a wave cutting through the canvas, but all the waves are very blended together. The last movement is the big finish to the whole thing. It's pulling in melodies from the rest of the music and the movements, and it's the only time that Anna uses black. So right at the beginning there's kind of a little chunk of black, and that's usually when her brain is going. There's a lot of animation happening here, and it's overriding her harmonic colors. So when we get to my paintings, it was the one time I actually got to use black because I had to stay true to her palette, so I was kind of excited about that. But this is the big chaotic, it's the big climax. There's a big shipwreck at the end, and it happens all the way till about here. It's dying away a little bit here. You can see it's getting lighter and lighter and broader. And this is where the Scheherazade comes back in with the soloist. And interesting, usually the soloist is on top, but she said, no, definitely the soloist was on the bottom, and these were the accompaniment instruments from the rest of the orchestra on the top, which I found interesting. But at the very end of these last couple of minutes, this is in the storyline. This is when Scheherazade is after 1001 nights of telling stories to keep the Sultan engaged, they finally fall in love, and she gets a full night of sleep, and so the whole thing kind of dies away. And so Anna ends with these very pastel colors, which again aren't her in the color palette, and it's just interesting that it's capturing that all the music is fading away. And there's one tiny little burst of a little stronger yellow, but it just happens in the middle of this long section of a darker yellow, and it's just a pop in there. And so I literally just drew a felt pen line down there. Waves, as we talked about, is first is referenced both by the composer and also by Anna's textures. So I kind of went with the theme of brain waves. And so you know how you see a scan and the brain waves twirl up and down across the image. And so I've used that imagery to kind of connect this piece, and there's just layers and layers of these brain waves. And in the actual, in Anna's movement, there's a blue that kind of connects across the canvas, and so I use that blue voice to reference where the brain waves are. And then remember I talked about in the end is where Scheherazade falls asleep in these very pastel colors. So when you see my 4 paintings together and Anna's 4 paintings, it's just this last segment, which still has a wave texture that I've created here, but the colors are in these soft pinks and blues and grays and greens, pastels, and then the very end again ending with the color of E, with that solid yellow belt at the end.
I hadn't realized how many colors happened within that period of time. I mean, they sort of just cycle and they've always been there, and I knew that they were there, but I don't think I realized like quite how many color thoughts I was having within such a short period of time. So that was really interesting and exciting for me. And so now I think I have a lot more awareness of what is actually happening in my brain, and I notice it more often, which is also kind of cool. I sort of notice when I'm listening to a piece of music, oh, this feels very purple to me, or very blue, or whatever it might be. I actually have multiple types of synesthesia, and most people with synesthesia do. So I see colors when I hear music, but I also associate numbers with colors. So every number from 1 potentially up to infinity has a different color for me.
I was anticipating that the art world and the artists, never mind what your practice is, they would be fascinated by the connection, the immediate connection that Anna experiences. But I've been fascinated that all walks of life have come and looked at the people that have seen it so far, have looked at these stripes, and when I tell the story going, wow, this all passes in front of her. It kind of stops you in your tracks. Each synesthete has their own palette, and she has this set of colors, and it'll be consistent according to the harmonic language. It was interesting to compare her palette with Rimsky-Korsakov's, of what we were able to find. I could find the major keys, I didn't find the minor keys, but as Maestro Raiskin talked about, the C was very important to him, and blue was the color, so it's probably not a coincidence that E minor is used a lot in this piece, because you get these big waves of sound. But interestingly enough, that E minor is yellow for Anna, but the language was lots of waves. These are in waves, Shirley, big waves, small waves, and that kept coming up consistently throughout the whole piece. So it was more a textural connection.
Shirley just brings so much uniqueness and so much passion to what she does. I remember the first time I saw a Shirley Elias original, and I was just blown away by the boldness and the excitement and the passion that I could see in the colors that she was using. And for Shirley to make that connection with my synesthesia, and she was sort of the one that started these conversations of, let's talk about music and art, and let's talk about music and color, and how these things sort of intersect with one another. And it's just been so incredible to have her as a mentor throughout this whole experience. I feel like I'm learning so much about the arts world and the music world and how they are all interconnected with one another. It's just been a really incredible experience.